fallout from this weekend summit in Quebec is still far from over. The satirical cartoon South Park once featured a song called Blame Canada. You might remember that for those fans. Well, that is the tune President Trump was playing after his contentious meeting with other G7 leaders, American allies. The president singled out for criticism Canadian Premier Justin Trudeau for what he called unfair trade practices. Joining us now, Veuger is an economist at the American Enterprise Institute, along with our Asher Westropp-Evans. Asher, a lot of claims being made about the U.S. getting ripped off. Are they true?
Look, when we target certain specific tariffs, there can be cases to be made. But if we can take a look now at overall tariff rates among G7 nations, we see that they're all actually pretty equal. The US is on par with the EU, UK, Italy, all those European nations, and Canada actually having lower average tariffs than we're seeing in the UK and in the US and other European allies. And it's interesting. I mean, Trump has come out targeting specifically this dairy tariff, that 270% dairy tariff that Canada has. But if we look at specific U.S. tariffs, such as tobacco, U.S. has import tariffs of 350% on tobacco. But taken in aggregate, when you look at the whole, tariffs have never been lower. We're at historic lows for average tariffs around the world, and particularly among these G7 trading partners, down to 1.6% or below. I mean, these are incredibly low figures when you compare to almost any point in trade history.
Right, and the bigger picture is important. It's not just about one product.
Right. Well, let's go to Stan Veuger in Washington. Stan, what about those numbers? President Trump seems to be talking about one reality, and as Asher shows us on these average tariff figures, it seems to be just a total picture altogether.
Yeah, I think those overall numbers are much more important. I think it's important not to buy into the White House's bad faith narrative that this trade conflict is about the way in which Canada deals with dairy prices. The U.S., of course, imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum imported from Canada and the EU for completely made-up national security reasons. The EU and Canada have decided to respond to that in kind, and I think that's what the administration got upset over. That's why Trump threw his hissy fit. I don't think we should pretend that there's some deep underlying discontent over Canadian dairy policy here that's driving this.
Asher, that statement by President Trump, sort of blowing up that joint communique, deepening the rift with American allies, creating new rifts with other old allies, that's not putting the White House, other officials, in a very comfortable spot.
No, it's certainly not. And while there have been backers, such as the economy advisor Larry Kudlow, who came out saying Trudeau stabbed the U.S. in the back.
Right, a lot of tough talk from White House officials on TV, that's for sure.
Absolutely, but others have taken a slightly more conciliatory tone. And we've heard from Pompeo in the lead up to the North Korean summit a little bit more of a welcoming tone to other U.S. allies. Take a listen.
We wouldn't be in this place. We wouldn't have this historic opportunity without the diplomatic work that's been done by our European partners alongside of us. President Trump has led an enormous coalition, including those very same European partners, those G7 partners to which you refer, who have helped us get to this point. I have every expectation that they will continue to do that. There are always irritants in relationships. I am very confident the relationships between our countries, the United States and those G7 countries, will continue to be move forward on a strong basis.
Stan, I want to ask you, we just looked at the latest figures out from Wall Street. The Dow, the markets are up. They seem to be perhaps more focused on optimism with Singapore. When are the markets perhaps going to react or not to these growing trade tensions and what looks like a growing, expanding trade war between the U.S. and its closest allies?
Well, we've seen them respond in the past as these new tariffs were announced, as they were ultimately imposed. But, you know, it's hard, except for in the case of specific companies, specific industries, to really tease out what the impact of a potentially escalating trade war is going to be. And so I don't think day-to-day fluctuations in the stock market are necessarily going to tell us what the impact is of this gradually expanding conflict.
Stan, it seems like some nations that maybe in the past, earlier in the Trump administration, would have treaded a bit more carefully, now are being more firm, saying that we're not going to deal with this and we have resolve to hit back with our own measures. Is that a risk? Do you think that the White House is maybe, or Trump specifically, is taking this a step too far, assuming that allies will fall in line?
Yeah, I don't know why they expected the EU and Canada to take these tariffs on steel and aluminum that are imposed on extremely flimsy grounds. Why they would take them lying down? I don't think any reasonable trade partner would do that. It's really bizarre, I think, that the U.S. has responded the way it has over the past 24 hours to the Canadian and European response to its trade practices. When you have a senior advisor to the president go on TV to announce that there is a special place in hell for the Canadian Prime Minister, and the Secretary of State is unwilling to walk that comment back, I think it's pretty clear who's behaving in a reasonable, mature way, and it's not the White House.
Asher, President Trump pointing out one could argue protectionist policies that Canada pursues on its dairy products. But the U.S. in certain areas does kind of match those practices, not perhaps with dairy.
Yeah, absolutely right. And, as I mentioned earlier, is this 350% tariff on tobacco. There's 160% on shelled peanuts. And the sugar system that the U.S. has put in place to protect their own sugar industry is a complex behemoth of quotas and protections that keeps that as effectively almost some have called a cartel. I mean, the U.S. has these practices in isolated points. And as Stan and I have sort of both mentioned earlier, while certain areas of the U.S., Canadian, Mexican, European markets are all protected, overall we're at historically low levels, and this is really important to remember. And this has allowed the sort of levels of global trade and free movement of money and companies that has set up the current global trade system, which is now currently, seemingly at least, under threat.
And that global system that the United States itself helped pioneer in so many ways has been really a champion of global trade, now seemingly walking it back in the Trump administration.